Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Module C, Craft of Writing for Standard. And before we do that, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, our traditional owners. The particular image I have on the screen at the moment is where I live. I live in Kiama and it's part of the Darwal country, particularly the Wadi Wadi people who came to this beautiful area for its shellfish and of course came down from the highlands. So I'd like to acknowledge them as traditional owners of where I live. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the craft of writing, or some of my friends from Coonabarabran call it CAL, how it fits into our HSC year. I'm going to look very, very quickly at the official aspects of what it is and some of the frequently asked questions. I want to talk about the 2019 exam, because not so much because that's the kind of exam you're going to get, but the implications for your own revision and learning and consolidation of where you are with this particular module. And then I want to do a little bit on different types of writing using some sample questions that we've had before. So just what I think is particularly important, and you'll see there that I have Sally Fitzgibbon, who's a local surfer and of course a world champion, and I'm going to use some of that as a metaphor for you, because Sally is an outstanding athlete because she works at it and because she hones her craft. And I think we need to consider that. One of the aspects that concerns me is that I'm not sure that everybody is dedicating 30 hours to this craft of writing. So you think about the amount of time that you spend on your other modules, we need to be spending that amount of time. As the original document said, it was to extend your repertoire. So students are always saying that they would prefer not to be just writing essays. Here's your opportunity to go beyond that essay writing and to tap into a really interesting way of writing. It's also for different audiences and purposes. So it's moved on from that very rigid, structured situation, always just writing in the same form. And at the same time, it's going to be building your own confidence and skills. And look at that last dot point. It's going to be reinforcing that important connection between reading and writing. I'm going to come back to that because that's really critical. So one of the aspects, and I'm going to also talk about, honing your craft as a singer as well as a sports person, and hence our image there. One of the things that we need to realise is that this is a totally dedicated question in paper 2. So it's not just an add-on, but it's a very important section. It is also going to provide you with marvellous opportunities to hone your craft in paper 1, section 1. So if we want to be totally pragmatic, 40% of your HSC is really about the craft of writing, let alone what other skills you can take to your other module. Now, two of these at least are your texts. And you could have a look at those and think, well, which are the texts that we're actually doing? Some schools are doing more than 2, and some schools are doing just the 2. So which one of those? There's 18 of those that you could be choosing from. And there's a range of texts that, and a lot of these texts are really interesting, and we'll come back to some of those later. What I want you to appreciate is that Module C counts. It's not only worth as much as the other modules. In other words, in paper 2, it is worth 20 of those 60 marks. But I really believe, and I've got a little bit of evidence from doing a straw poll around some schools, that it can be the difference in your final mark. And whatever you want to do with that mark, it might be very significant, particularly if it is going to be contributing to the significance of your ATAR or wanting to get into a particular course. So I really think we need to start thinking about how much time and effort are you giving to this particular section 1. The other one is that it's also a major component of your assessment schedule, up to about 25%. Some of you will have already have done this, but some schools are leaving it until later in term 3. So when we think about this idea of craft, Think about some of these sports people who are on the screen at the moment, great sports people in Australia and also around the world. What do you admire about the way these sports people have mastered their craft? You know, think about Ash Barty. She's just taken the world by storm, and has entered our hearts because of her wonderful craft. What would you like to be able to do that Roger Federer can do? How would you be able to copy? Could you copy some of the style, some of the skills, some of the passion that these sports people have? Because the passion is important too. What about if you could sing? Like, who would you say would be a singer that you would love to be able to imitate or emulate or be something like it, or play the guitar like somebody, or play the drums, or paint like? And then say, who would you like to write like? Who influences you? Who shaped you? Who's given you the passion and excitement? So before we move any further, let's have a look at where does Module C fit into the HSC exam. And I'm going to continue with some of these ideas about great singers and great sports people. Okay, so first of all, we said it fits into section 3. And as you can see there, here is last year's paper. And very, very important that it mentions that we've got 3 sections, each worth exactly the same marks. But more importantly, each section has exactly the same amount of time. That is 40 minutes. So one of the big challenges is, how can you build your capacity to have 40 minutes left? I know that sounds like a really sort of strange question, but if you don't have 40 minutes left, how are you going to showcase your skills? How are you going to be able to write really well and then talk about your writing? How are you also going to be able to think on your feet? Because one of the important directions that the HSC is going in is this unexpectedness, that you cannot necessarily prepare the actual question. Therefore, you're going to be much more flexible and adaptable in your thinking. And the other thing is, how can we build your capacity for time management, particularly if there's going to be a 2-part question? Now, if we look at this one from last year, again, we're told that you've got 40 minutes, that it's worth 20 marks. Notice it's only got 2 dot points for the criteria, which we'll look at in a moment. There was this stimulus, this visual stimulus, and look what you had to do with it. You had to write an imaginative, discursive or persuasive writing that ends with that image. And then you had to do something else. You had to explain how your study of the craft of writing has enabled you to actually create that one. Now I'm going to come back to all of those questions. So as I said earlier, Sally Fitzgibbon has become the star surfer, one of the star surfers of the world by surfing. Okay, so she becomes a better surfer by surfing. You can only become a better writer by writing. So think about from now on, so here we are, we're into late June, you've got until October. You can give yourself opportunities. Don't wait for your teachers to give them to you. Give yourself opportunities in what I call low risk and no risk, where the marks don't matter, where you're not under stress, where you can just give yourself these opportunities to respond to a variety of prompts, whether you take a line from one of your module text or a line from your module C text, or you just take a photograph in your own area. Then writing in different ways, imaginatively, persuasively, discursively. And yes, I would suggest that you could write informatively, even though that isn't going to, it's not likely it's going to be one of the NESA suggestions. And then become your own critic. Sit back and you critique your own writing. You have become a writer. Now you critique your own writing about what you have learnt about the craft of writing. But no way can you even think that you are going to become a good writer unless you feed yourself with reading or viewing. But you've got to be feeding yourself in some way. And so one of the points that NESA said to us when we first started this was that students should be having their own wide reading. They need models, they need stimulus, because you can't do this in a vacuum. So if you like Sally, and she's always training. She's a top athlete. She's a top runner, as well as a futsal player, as well as a surfer. She's got to train. So for you to be train in Module C, you need to be reading. So how much reading are you doing to feed your own writing? How much writing are you doing to improve your craft? And we can't write about anything in a vacuum. Where do we get those particular ideas from? Now, I've just taken a shot here of some of my favourite adolescent fiction novels at the moment, and there's so many there, you know, from the latest beautiful Coconut Children, which I really, really recommend to you. But, you know, there's ones here written as verse novels, there's ones written, there's dystopian novels, there's a whole lot of things. There's non-fiction. Anything you read is going to help you to become a better writer. So before we go too much further, I just want to alert you to the frequently asked questions, which were put out by NESA last February. Okay, so February in 2019. I'm not going to go through them all, but I am just going to confirm a couple of things. Note that it says that the Module C is the focus is on composition. So that's about how well you compose text. And of course, you apply the insights that you've gained from other writers. But this is not about a critical study or a close study. This is about your own composition. Will it focus on a particular part of the rubric or the module statement, like it does in, for example, the common module? We can expect something on, say, paradoxes or anomalies. In module B, we can expect something that says distinctive qualities, but we're not going to get that here. It's going to be a craft question. So are you expected to analyse a text? It says no. But of course, you are going to show your understanding of Luca Lesson or the surfer or the pedestrian or Crouch End. And your understanding of that is going to be what is going to be feeding your craft. I think this is interesting. Can you use a hybrid? Can you have a combination of imaginative, informative, persuasive, and discursive? And those people who marked the teachers who marked last year's said some of the best pieces were a hybridity of each of those forms. Now, it's a little bit more difficult, but we don't have to get ourselves tied down to, has this got only the features of discursive? Because we're really focusing on the craft. And I think the other questions is absolutely critical. Will you be required to write a complete piece? Now, if it's a two-part question, and it really absolutely could be, there's no way you can write a complete piece. So how much time have you been giving yourself in writing the opening or the middle or the conclusion, which is exactly what the exam question was? So if there are going to be two parts, let's look at this. If it's one part, you will be expected, like you are for the other modules, to write about 800 words. You might have a stimulus in there. You might be asked to draw on one of your Module C texts for inspiration, or it might actually say draw on a text from any one of your modules. But it's more likely, I think, to be two parts, because that way you're able to demonstrate your understanding of how other texts have influenced and shaped your own writing. So if you've got two parts, the big question is, first of all, have you got 40 minutes left? Secondly, how are you going to divide that 40 minutes? And again, we come back to, just like in section 1 of paper 1, you divide it according to the mark value. That is being pragmatic, that's being sensible. If it is a two-part question, it's more likely a fragment, a moment, an opening. And then the other part will be how well you have crafted the piece, how you critique yourself as a writer. You may be asked to specifically refer to some Module C text, or you may be asked for a more sort of general focus on the craft of writing. So let's look more carefully or more closely at last year's paper so that we can see the sorts of things that you can expect. And I'm not saying let's look at this from the point of view of this is going to be repeated, because it's not. But it will be a wonderful opportunity for you in your class time to actually workshop this question in groups, in pairs, and then individually. Please note that the exam criteria is exactly the same for standard and advanced, and the focus is on craft. okay? We need to come back to this idea. It's about your ability to compose. The first dot point, craft the language according to the question, and then use language to deliberately shape your meaning. So you as the writer are deliberately shaping the meaning for the reader. So we've talked about this importance of having the full 40 minutes. And you really must allocate 5 minutes to planning. It would be impossible. I would find this very, very difficult to do if I didn't plan this time out. So please note there that you've got the 2-part set. I'm just going to show you. If you've got, so we've got the coloured visual of a contemporary urban landscape. I've spoken to some students and they've said to me they think it's a shot of Melbourne. And I actually did look for it, and I think it is a shot of Melbourne. But it clearly is not a country town, is it? It's clearly not an outback area. It does have that sort of contemporary urban look to it. The 2 parts, we had the first part was worth 12 marks and the explanation is worth 8 marks. So that's critical of looking at that. Now, who's to say that we're going to have that again? So you therefore have to give yourself opportunities to say, all right, if it is the same 12 marks on part A, I need to be spending around about 20 minutes. But I've got to be very firm with myself and stop that writing, because there's no point in continuing that writing and not having an opportunity to finish the second one. So give yourself some opportunities to say, okay, I'm going to write for 20 minutes and then I'm going to stop and I'm going to write for 15 minutes on the critiquing of my writing. You might even consider inverting that and saying, all right, I'm going to write for 15 minutes because it might only be worth 8 marks. Or it could be like the advanced paper where they were equal, 10 marks each. That means you've got to be really strict with yourself, and at about 18 minutes, you stop and you move on to the other part. Just like the same sort of skills that you have in paper 1, section 1. And those of you who are doing short answers in biology or in history, you're used to this fragmented type of time frame. So please create for yourselves these opportunities of a 12 and an 8 and a 12, or a 10 or a 10. Okay, so look at this particular question. The question asked you to actually finish your writing with what is actually happening in that visual. You had to conclude by capturing what was happening in that one. You could choose to write in imaginative, persuasive or discursive, and it didn't suggest that you could have written informatively. It does provide challenges for those of you who might have thought, oh, I've got my, one-off story that I'm going to write. Well, if you were able to manipulate your story and have it just finishing at the end, that's fantastic. But you don't want to put yourself under pressure. You want to have lots of different writing opportunities of writing a beginning, a middle, an end, a segue, anything like that, changing the mood. So always you've got to be thinking too, what is effective writing? How can I make my piece of writing effective so you've got something at least to critique in part B? When you have a look at the criteria, it's really, really important that you focus on this criteria, because you can use this to judge your own writing. Notice that the writing must work so that the ideas, the content of the visual be a natural conclusion. Now, you would expect that in the A range and the B range, but actually even the C range says you have to conclude with the stimulus. So if you ignore the stimulus, I'm sorry, but you will be looking at possibly a much lower kind of mark than you might have expected. So don't think that you can just ignore that one. Even the idea of crafting is in 3 of the 4 mark ranges, where you have to have a range of language devices or stylistic features in the A range, also a range in the B range, and then when we get to the C range there, some, but you've still got to have some. And also the control of language needs to be suited to not only the purpose and the audience, but the selected form. So that's a really important thing. So when you're doing your own pieces of writing, why don't you in groups or in pairs, say, okay, I want you to mark my piece of writing based on these criteria. How well has my piece of writing suited those particular criteria? And you can apply these criteria here to a whole range of writing styles, not just to the exam. Okay. Oh. Have a look at, so here's some messages from the Marking Centre. The stimulus must feature. You must conclude with the stimulus. Now, please have a look at the message. I think that last year's marking report was one of the best that I've seen in a long, long time. And I've been involved in, writing these in different situations. And I think that this particular set of reports was very good. So it's there for you. So I just type in NESA past English papers, takes you to the site, and I click on standard, go to last year's paper and go down it. And therefore what I've done here is I've taken the messages. So the stimulus must feature, you must conclude with it. Your ability to write or craft is the key. So if you write in a very bland, dull way, how can you showcase your different stylistic devices if you haven't used any? So, if you're trying to train at the moment for, the build up of your sporting competition, you've got to showcase your skills. And it also needs to be engaging. If it's deadly dull, if it's deadly boring, if there's no passion in it, if there's no boldness, if there's no joy in it, it isn't going to be engaging. So think about what Luca Lesson says. He says, may your grey matter no longer be grey. We don't want grey, bland stuff. We want bright, fun, colourful, exciting, dramatic stuff. So it has to be engaging. And similarly, you do have to show, I know this is a first draft, but we do want to see that you can control the elements of your writing. Why do the markers continue to say this same thing? Because students are not doing it for whatever reason. So if in your situation in classes, you can interrogate this visual. Where could it be? Who could be there? What could the character be doing? What's the mood of this particular one? Could you make it a literal interpretation about graffiti, for example? Do you make it as a metaphoric or symbolic interpretation? Consider the kinds of ideas we could talk about, especially if you're doing a persuasive or a discursive piece. You could talk about the pros and cons of urban life, the loneliness of cities. You could use it as a metaphor for choices. And so, the road not taken is going to work there. A path to somewhere else. The need for colour in our lives, nature, for example. And so you might like to look at that as a bit of a sort of the dualism. Or graffiti, just take it very, very literally and talk about the role of graffiti. Then you can say, okay, how can I use my Module C text? Which texts that you have done could have helped you to craft your language, craft your story, craft your language choices and devices to suit that particular image. And look, you've really got to think about part B before you start writing part A. Because if it says that you've got to use a range of stylistic devices and you're not using it, you've got to stop yourself and say, as a writer, come on, I've got to start doing a better job than this. The challenges for me, I think, on this whole craft of writing is part B. And I think this is the difference. And I've spoken to some teachers in other schools who have said that they see it as the difference between a band. So if it's 8 marks or 10 marks where you are critiquing your own writing, it's very possible that you can do badly in this, even though you did wonderfully in the first part. So this critique is very important. It's not a reflection so much as an analysis of your own writing, as a justification of the choices that you have been saying. So have a look at this question. How, in what ways? Okay, I always said this as a marker myself. You look at that word how, in what ways? So it can be the ideas, it can be the devices, it could be the language, it could be the structure, it could be the point of view, the tone. How has that study of your craft of writing enabled you to create an engaging piece? Now notice that it talks about the craft of writing. It doesn't say that you must specifically acknowledge one of your Module C texts, but I think there's an implication there that you would say that by being inspired by Luca Lesson's passion or being inspired by Judith Wright's magnificent imagery, that you've been able to produce this piece of writing. And of course, it must have detailed reference to what you've actually done. So you need to be using your piece of writing and then critiquing that and drawing out specific examples from that. So if you have a look at this, this criteria, when you're doing your own practice of module of part Bs, have a look at that. Have you, in a detailed and relevant manner, explained how the study of the craft of writing has enabled this piece of writing? Have you explained in a detailed and relevant manner how language has been used? Now, if you haven't got many devices, if you haven't got a variety, a range of techniques, how can you talk about them? So that's why I say this part A and part B has got to be seen as a package. And the more times you do this, it will just be natural for you. So if we look at the implications, getting that big picture of you as a writer, I know that's very difficult because all the writers that we have in the Module C text are highly experienced. And as an adolescent, you are still honing your skills. And I think this is the most demanding part. It's got to be explicit and it's got to be structured. And of course, it does assume that you've actually used a range of writing skills. In the Marcus report, it says you need to commence with a clear opening statement of your intention. What were you intending to do with this piece of writing? What kind of mood were you intending? Was it looking at a persuasive or a discursive, or was it a hybrid of each of those? Use quotations from your own work. So stand back from your work and treat yourself as the writer. So, you know, you as the writer, John Smith, the writer, is now you're going to critique that piece. But you can't do this if the first time you do this is, say, in your assessment task or in the trial, and so the third time you do it is in the exam. No way. You've got to give yourself lots of frequent, ongoing, and remember what I said before, low risk, no risk situations, so that it doesn't matter if you muck it up in those situations. Now, there's some terrific resources around for you, and probably about July, the latest checkpoints from Cambridge, which is a joint project with ETA. And you'll see on the other side of your screen that there is a list there of the sample responses. And I really recommend that you go to that particular, this site here. And that, of course, once these books come out, please buy them because they're really very, very valuable books. Now, in that particular edition that's coming out, Mark Graffiti, who's not only is he a fabulous teacher at Ulladulla High School, but he's also a writer. And so one of the editors, Mel Dixon, has been able to get Mark to write this. So he actually wrote a discursive piece. And I think it's wonderful to have a look at this. And so when you get this book, please critique his piece of writing with the criteria. So I've got the beginning of it here and a little bit later as well. And then he actually critiques his own writing. The purpose of this feature article. Now, a feature article is a wonderful example of a discursive piece of writing. It was a journey through varying tones, from humorous to serious, on the subject of leaving one's mark. So notice too that he's actually got, he's actually put a title in there, Go Ahead, Leave Your Mark. And of course, I'm sure that knowing Mark, there was probably a little bit of a pun there as well. A primary way my meandering stall was influenced after studying the science fiction visionary and dystopic narrative from Ray Bradbury. Right in the beginning, he is talking about one of his Module C. A particularly powerful moment in The Pedestrian occurs. And look at how he has taken information and content and craft from his own writing as well as from Ray Bradbury. So I really do suggest that you have a look at these particular publications when they come out. It won't be too late. It'll be just perfect timing for you. Mark also did another example of a persuasive piece. So he's taken the same, and we've got some other ones as well, but I just wanted to show you these that sometimes create the greatest angst for students, the discursive and the persuasive. So here's a persuasive piece, and the final paragraph of bringing us back, graffitied somewhere in the back of our minds. We won't remember the new couch that grew old quickly or the car that lost its love, but the alleyways of memory will call us through time and old age. Then he goes, when I was penning this persuasive piece, I wanted to convince the reader that there were many positives to travelling. So then he talks about it, and who does he call upon? He calls upon Judith Wright's poem, The Surfer, talking about delighting in the waves. So really have a look at these when it comes out. The other thing that is coming out soon are the workbooks from NESA. So again, I would just suggest that you type in NESA exam workbooks, and there's the whole suite of the English ones coming out. And this will be really, really interesting for you to have a look at how students in standard have crafted various examples of that particular question. So please look out for that as well. So when we look about this, we need to say which one of our, or which two of my Module C texts will best inspire me to write this. It's like, you know, choosing which poems are you going to write about in Module A or B or in the common module. You can't write about them all. So you've got to say on the day, which one of these are going to best suit. So on the day, you're going to say which one of my particular Module C text is going to be best. And then you've got to build your own repertoire of devices, writing in the first, the second, or the third person, or mixing them up, sustaining imagery, having a recurring motif, particularly for a discursive piece, and using the NESA marking criteria to interrogate and to judge and to critique your own writing. So you could, in class, you could create a scenario for what would be you know, you can use this one, for example. You can say, okay, what's actually going to be happening there? How can we write an imaginative piece? And say, okay, how are we going to start this? Because that's always the most difficult. You don't have to fill in the backstory for the writer. The writer, assume the writer, the reader rather, has already read the beginning of your discursive piece or the beginning of your imaginative piece, and just get them into the end of it. So a little bit of the backstory, but very little of that. And then also give yourself opportunities to interrogate visuals, where, you know, you live in a very visual world now, and so look at lots of visual, create them yourself. So this one here is the view out of my window at the moment, and this one is where a place that I go on holidays, and this is a lovely shot of my dad, who I lost last year, and my husband and my daughter and her husband. So there's lots of lovely things that I could be now writing about, that reflecting on dad in good times. And so places that we visit, places that we want to be. So you can take them yourself on your phone. You can Google images, but don't be restricted in the kinds of images that you find. Practice middles and openings and endings. Find you know, from a favourite piece of writing. You know, remember I said to you about this Coconut Children. It is an extraordinary piece of writing. Have a look how she has crafted the opening, the middle, the ending. Find an awesome opening or a fabulous song or a wonderful article. But it is immersing yourself in really, really good examples. So let's just have now a look at what it says about the text. It says that there are texts that exemplify, in other words, show writing styles, as well as comment on writing. So you will get some texts that will tell you about how to be a writer, and then there'll be texts that will tell you about writing, give an example of really good writing. And I'd be looking at some examples of both of those different kinds of texts. So on one side here, we've got the examples of the wonderful craft of Judith Wright or Ray Bradbury or Linda Burney's magnificent speech. Over here, they're also very well crafted, but they tell us about the passion for writing, the importance of writing, and how we can become a better writer. And I know a lot of people are doing one of each. If you haven't looked at the ones on the reflection on writing, please do so. So what are your text choices? How can you connect to those? How can you make them speak to you? Sometimes the teachers are making choices for you, and again, you might be thinking, oh, you know, I'm not connecting with Crouch End. But the more you look at it, you'll be able to find some really rich material. How can you get them to influence? How will these pieces influence you? Could you use your text for its ideas? So it doesn't only have to be on the style of writing, but it could be on giving you an idea for a piece of writing, or as a language model. Is it better suited to use the surfer for another piece of imaginative writing? Or do you want to take it into a discursive piece? How many texts are you actually exploring? And I think a minimum should be 2, especially when some of them are only really short. How much time have you spent on each text? What are you actually doing with those texts? Are you using them as a springboard? Are you critiquing them as pieces of writing? And how flexible are your texts to work with? Will that text give you enough spring into changing the ending, for example, into changing the mood, into talking about characterization? And I think the more, if you think about the conceptual framework of last year's question, we need to be perhaps looking at some of the texts that talk about craft. And one of my favorite, and you'll see that I use Luca Lesson's images a lot. I think the more you can read what he says about that writing is a craft that should have as much passion in it as anything. And if you think about it, whether you're a top surfer or you play the guitar well, or you can be a singer, if your passion is there, if you believe in it, if you are colourful in everything you do, you will engage people. And he is very good about talking about passion. Whereas Sylvia Plath is more structured, and she talks about that, you know, the poem is the closed fist, whereas prose is much more open. And isn't that a wonderful metaphor? So maybe take a piece of advice from either one of them and demonstrate how you have shown that your grey matter may no longer be grey, for example. So how does Luca Lesson persuade you to talk about the importance of passion and writing in sharing about what you feel passionate about? Look at his stylistic choices. You could use this beautifully as a persuasive piece or a discursive piece on what I am passionate about, what I care deeply about. So for each of your Module C texts, how has the author crafted the text to present a perspective? Because that's what writing is about, giving you a perspective on their particular subject or ideas. What are the features of their craft that stand out? So you've got to stand back. You've got to read the whole of Crouch End, or the pedestrian, or the surfer, or any of the other ones, or the speeches, and you've got to stand back and say, what stands out? What makes it effective? What stylistic devices could you use? Could this work as a springboard or as a model in your own writing? And how could you use it? And then how would you be able to use this text to explain your own craft? Now, this is just a little grid that I did because I was a bit concerned that students were not sort of looking at say the themes and ideas in each one of the other texts. So you could just do this. It's a really nice way of summing that up. So what are the main ideas in your common module, in your module A, in your module B, and then your other texts? What are the distinctive language choices? And in what way could you use this as a springboard into your own writing? I also think if we can, the more we think about this idea of craft, and so looking at, say, your any poem that you might have done in the common module or module A or module B, how has the composer crafted this scene or this poem or this paragraph to get us to consider cultural tension, for example? How have they composed this text to shape our response? Really is the bookend of the entire course. It's paper 1, section 1, and now, of course, it's paper 2, section 3. You also can double dip into this. And I had a look, I was looking at the paper 1, section 1, and you know, I was talking to a teacher who said that this particular section gave his students last year the greatest amount of angst. where we had a poem from Samuel Wagon Watson, a wonderful Indigenous poet. And it was a poem that was actually common to both advanced and standard. Explain how boomerangs in a thunderstorm represent an intense moment. Now, there is your craft of writing already. So you've got this accent, and I don't want to speak to it now, but he has captured this really powerful, intense moment. And the question was about how does that particular poem represent, show, demonstrate, reveal through the particular devices used an intense moment. So you could do this yourself. So you could say, okay, what are the various language choices? Is it his narrative voice? Is it his word choices? Is it his sentences? Is it his use of tense and verbs and imagery? So it's just a tiny little piece. It would only take you, 10 minutes to discuss this in pairs or in groups to do it. Then you could share your own personal intense moment. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of images from the bushfires. Now, I live on the South Coast, and it was probably, I found it a much more challenging time than I found the COVID time, because it was just so intense in the experiences that we're having. And so here's a shot from a Lake Conjola, which of course was one of the most devastated areas of the South Coast. So describe an intense moment of your own, only 150 words, and then compare the ways that you created that intensity with Samuel Wagon Watson. And I think that would be a really interesting thing to do. So it's so easy to find these images. Just go bushfires 2019 New South Wales or Australia, and you will come up with some of the most extraordinary bushfires. Look at this. Couldn't you just start with the kookaburra there and looking across? Just look at the colours, the intensity, and it says about an intense moment in your life. Now, another thing that I want us to look at are the NESA sample questions. Sometimes when we're into the second round of a course, or second round of the second year of the course, we tend to forget about the sample questions. Go back to these sample questions because they will be really useful as workshop. So we just had that little tiny extract there. And then you had a question about how does the writer create the mood? And then you had to write the next part of the narrative. Now, what's interesting is in this case, the analysis of the text comes first. All right, so the first part was describe how, in what ways the writer creates a mood or atmosphere. Make reference to at least one language device, and then you do your own piece. So it is possible that you would analyse the piece and then come back to writing your own piece. So it doesn't matter what order this is given in, you just got to accept it. So the analysis came first, your own writing was second. There was no specific reference to Module C text, but of course, your immersion in your Module C text is going to give you the opportunity. And what you could do then is to take a paragraph of description from any one of your Module C texts and do that same question. Okay, so come back to that. So how does the writer create a mood or atmosphere? So whether it be in The Dreamers or whether it be in Home, which is a fabulous piece, or The Pedestrian, that would work beautifully for this. And then do your own piece of writing in response to that. So what I've done here is I've just highlighted some of the things that you would need to be looking at. So you've got to interrogate how this particular writer has created this particular piece of writing. And then I've given you the example. So I've talked about the setting, I've talked about the vivid images, I've talked about the clever metaphor, the contrast, the strong verb. So you are critiquing the actual craft. So the next part of it is, all right, we've got to come up on the spot, what could have happened to have changed the mood? So I just thought, this was the most beautiful calm scene, and then we have, you know, a pack of sort of bogans turn up and they're just going to interrupt the craft scene and the camp scene, and suddenly it would be absolutely terrible. So you could have a bit of fun with that, and I had a bit of fun with it as well. So I've just written here, and I've got these guys, heavy metal music thudded, the young males are rocking the tray, they're all yelling out, Aussie, 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 oink, 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 you know, so that sort of little, I'd actually just been to see Lord of the Flies, the play, and that's what inspired me to change that oink, oink, oink. So you could be thinking about writing your own piece, and you see it's only short, but it's got to be a piece of crafted material. In the second sample, that's not necessarily the kind of setting that we're all used to, but you would need to interrogate that. So look what it says. It says that use the image to write creatively about a character's response, and then assess how effectively you evoked. So you've got this time, you're doing the writing, and secondly, you're doing the critiquing. So look at that. What elements of the setting that would you look at? And of course, first time for me would be looking at that huge marble column and the staircase. How would you best show the character's response? Is it going to be some dialogue, or the verbs, or the detail, or short sentences, for example? So you need to critique actually how that's done. And notice too that we've got, this is evenly spread, 10 and 10 happening there. So, okay, I wrote this piece. Now, when I was writing this piece, I had the back of my mind, I've got to put in some techniques here. Otherwise, what am I going to critique? Okay, if I don't have a few, you know, clever little ball skills, how am I going to convince the coach that I should be in the team? The same sort of thing here. So I've got this, you know, sort of pretty obvious kind of simile here, but I've got these short sentences, and I've got this repetition. I've got the use of gold and silver and glowed, and of course the first person. So it's not a stunning piece of writing by any means, but I wanted to be sure that I could critique, that I had some craft examples to actually critique. So I've said I've effectively evoked the character's response through a range of different language choices, and I've gone on to talk about those. So let's now just have a look at using some of the text as a bit of a springboard. And obviously I cannot spend very much time on this, but I want you to be aware that there are some terrific examples out there. So the current Cambridge Standard Checkpoint, so the 2019-20 edition, has a marvellous example of writing an imaginative response in using the surfer, and it's got a fabulous reflection. So think about, have a look at that one, and then maybe use it as a springboard for your own writing. I know lots of people are doing the pedestrian. It's a fantastic short story, and please make sure that you listen to the audio version of it, because you can, you know, really sort of captures that anxiety and tension. So what kind of features of this particular text, the ideas, or the setting, or the tension, or the future, the dystopic style of setting that you could use for your writing? So use one of the lines. Just take any line, and there's so many wonderful lines there. He was all alone in this world of AD 2053. Was that a murmur of laughter from within a moon white house? So any one of your texts, just choose 3 or 4 really effective lines and use that as a way of writing your own. And in this case, you could have changed the mood. Melissa Lukashenko, I think this is a marvellous piece of writing, because look how she opens, give me an axe, and she closes with, get me an axe, thought Jane. And look how, and what I've done in the next slide is I've done which is one of my favourite things to do, is to analyse the language. And so look at her, that you couldn't find a more arresting opening than that, give me an axe. And then look at her verbs, blurted and cawed, a hen cawed, and look at the way she's using her adjectives. What image is a formica counter? Her brimming eyes, a hasty step, his rancid half style, the gloomy corners, the ragged hibiscus. So all of those kind of things, you need to be looking at the writing. With responding to home, I think home is a marvelous one too. And so you could just look, what are the various language techniques? Find an example. What is the effectiveness, the purpose of the way that Catherine Cole has crafted this particular piece of writing? And I think it's a marvelous one. If you were doing Carol Chan's popcorn, think about the foods that remind you of places. And so often we talk about people coming from different lands and not being able to get the kind of food. And so we're not talking about the crummy kind of popcorn that she talks about at the end that you can only now get in 7-Eleven. We're talking about the popcorn in the street stalls of Bangkok. And think about importance of food. We often use food as a symbol for values, attitudes, perspectives, but of just enjoying being together. Look at the title. And so remember, we talked about Mark's title about Make Your Mark. Sometimes it's really wonderful to think of a clever title. So write a short story where food is the central motif of celebration. And I'm sure you've all got stories of favourite Christmas days when, various aunts and uncles bring along a wonderful dish. Or what is your choice of food for a birthday celebration? Or what's your favourite sort of picnic spot to go to? I just want to briefly talk about discursive, because I know that this gives people a lot of angst. But if you look at this particular image there, it's about meandering, but it's not pointless. It's not without a destination. It's got to go somewhere. It's got to start somewhere. It's got to finish somewhere, even though it meanders a little bit. And look, you can't do any better than having a look at the metaphor, the English Teachers Association Journal, issue 4, 2018, where the ETA was skilling people up about discursive writing. And it comes from the Latin, which means to run about. And we get that word discursive, and hence all of these particular images that I have used. Now, in the frequently asked questions from NESA back in February 2019, it says that it can explore an issue or an idea. And you can suggest a position or a point of view. So you can be yes and no, and positives and negatives, different angles, a different theme, a different issue. You can have some personal anecdotes. It can be in the first person, but you can use the third person. You can use figurative language, but it can also have factual. You can draw on your own experience, or you can draw on wide reading. It can have interesting language features. Now look at this discursive. This is from the Maldives. Wouldn't that be magnificent? It's going somewhere. It's either going to your own hut there, or you're going to end up in the restaurant here, but you're going to get somewhere, aren't you, as you meander through that magnificent water. And as you meander it through, what are all the wonderful things that you're going to be seeing? So that's important. Now, I really like Richard Glover as a writer. Have a look at this particular one that is now, he wrote this in March 2019 about the situation that occurred in Christchurch. And in the online version, he uses this old Zephyr. And there was a time that we didn't have seatbelts. But he's saying that now maybe we need to be legislating, maybe we need to be restricting social media, just like we had to restrict ourselves to actually start wearing seatbelts. Sometimes we've got to have some things done for us for our own good. So have a look at this, because he meanders through it, but he uses lots of important points in his discussion. He also wrote some beautiful ones in the bushfires. And of course, this is his home. He's got a holiday home in near Braidwood, and his neighbours saved it. So he's talking from his own experience, but he writes beautifully. And think about, it's very simple stuff. This is not way over the top that you might be finding far too difficult. I've seen this recently done where some students had to take their own town, and in this case, this fellow took Wollongong. And so he wanted to praise Wollongong, but not for its beaches, for its football team. And so he wrote this lovely discursive piece about weaving in and out of Wollongong, and of course ending up at Wynn Stadium and talking about, various footballers. So what aspects of your town And think about where would this best suit? You could see, you know, it might be on an online surfing magazine or a tourist blog or a blog for Australia that you're trying to encourage people to visit it. So when we look about this, the surfer, it's not only a magnificent piece of imaginative writing, but you could use it as a starting point for the joys and the perils of surfing, not just the wonder of you surfing. And you could imagine this working really well on an online or in the paper version of Tracks or Surfing Well. So go to that particular site and see the kinds of stories that are being written, and you could use Judith Wright. Have a look at the George Orwell one, because we've been talking about some of the challenges of sport and its violence. It's so much about what George Orwell was writing about. He says serious sport has nothing to do with foul play. It's bound up with hatred and jealousy and boastfulness. Wouldn't that be a wonderful springboard into your own piece of writing about, you know, the salary cap, or about when Super League was around, or about, you know, the issues involved with when the rugby league has returned to playing. If you have a look at your Module C text, all of those not only will give you some ideas about the craft, but it will give you some ideas about what topics you could write about. And so you might like to look at, I know some people are looking at, dear Mrs. Dunkley, some teachers or some mentors or school. And, you know, the whole sort of COVID experience has shown that, wow, don't we like going to school? School is somewhere where we would prefer to be rather than online learning in our lounge room. Look at the Paul Keating one. It's magnificent for sacrifice of war and national identity. Rowling's wonderful piece about the importance of imagination and reading. What about Stopping by Woods? It's fantastic. So when we look about persuasive writing, have a look at what are the examples, because it could be a straightforward essay. You're writing heaps of those, aren't you? Persuading the reader all the time. But it might be a speech, or it might be an argument, or it might be the beginning of a persuasive article. And so, yes, you can use the first person. And in fact, you can use the first person in essays. It's so important. And so you might be asked to write a speech, and therefore, you know, what kind of a speech? And you've had lots of exposure to some stunning speeches over the last couple of years. So you've got to have your position. Is it very clear? Really confident opening. Develop your argument, and it can't be just a general rave. We want lots of substantiated specific evidence. You need to back your opinions with reason and evidence. Vary your devices. Have that toolkit of techniques, that recurring motif. Use the second person. Use tricolon, because we know from all of those speeches that if you do things in threes, it's so effective. Be forceful, be bold, be inspired by Luca Lesson about may your pen grace the page. May there be full of grace in what you say. In other words, full of beauty, full of thrill, full of joy, full of passion, which of course he's saying. And of course you've got to be convincing. And just very quickly, have a look at some of these. You could look at Steve Jobs' speech about how he influenced your piece of writing. So you might be talking about a persuasive piece about how you have been preparing for the HSC, which is, you know, sort of the biggest item of your life at the moment. And he talks about these big, important moments in our lives. I love this particular speech by Paul Keating. I think it's the strongest of all of them. An effective speech is not just about what you are saying, but it's also about how you are saying it. So look at all of the different types of techniques and look at the kinds of language that Paul Keating was using. And it really is still today regarded as one of the best speeches that has been made. Just very quickly looking at reflective, it's a lovely word to use, but I really think that we should be saying it's less reflecting and more justification, more analysis of you as a writer. And I just want to share this. My brother lives in Canada, and he just sent me this recently to show me that the ice had started to melt in the lake at his house. So I thought, well, I'll bring that in. That's the jetty there. Isn't that beautiful? So it's about critiquing your own craft. And we come back to Sally has become a fantastic surfer because she surfs. You can become a fantastic writer by writing, and then you'll have something to critique. So you sure you can use the first person in this reflective writing? This has come out of that frequently asked document as well. But you've got to have, look at that word considered, okay? This is not just a sort of random selection of you know, chucking in bits and pieces. It's got to be a considered use of examples. And yes, you can use anecdotal references. You can use imagery, but it's got to have this very strong explanation. Therefore, it comes back to what you have learnt about the craft of writing. And the best way to be a better writer, of course, is to do some more reading. And I really need to impress upon that. So you could write a 200-word reflection on, say, just 2 or 3 stylistic choices that were made by, say, George Orwell in Politics of Language, or Luca Lesson, or Carol Chan, or one of the speeches, or any one of those, in Crouch End, in Pedestrian, in The Dreamers, in Home. Just choose 2 or 3 stylistic choices and write a reflection about how they've been used and how you could possibly use them yourself. Now, the important thing is, and I'm coming back to this to finish off, is that Part B in Module C, if we do get a Part B, is not money for nothing. So you've got to have very structured, and that's say, use that table that I was telling you about. It's got to be concrete, it's tight, it's specific. It's got to have well-supported evidence. Go back to have a look at what the criteria says. It's not a general rave. It's not about, you know, how you really feel about all of this. We've got to have really strong, concrete material. Incorporate examples of your own writing where you can show those, how you've demonstrated the influences. So have a look at what Mark has written in the Cambridge one. But also you've got to be able to think quickly and efficiently. And the only way you can do that is to give yourself plenty of opportunities, remember, in no risk, low risk situation. So if we go back to that Part B, which I think is the difference of a ban for some people, have you used a range of effective stylistic choices in your Part A? In other words, have you been engaging? What have you used to engage? Then how well can you explain and justify those stylistic choices? Then how well can you explain the features of your chosen Module C text that have influenced or shaped your own craft? I'm going to finish here with Donald Graves, and somebody who, of course, has been a very important contributor to the whole notion of English pedagogy. I think this still has so much resonance. Writing is extolled, worried over, cited as a national priority, but seldom practiced. The problem with writing, it's not poor spelling, punctuation, grammar, and handwriting. The problem with writing is no writing. So please, folks, get those books out and start reading. Read anything. Enjoy reading for pleasure and start to realise that you are a writer too. Thank you very much and all the very best.